Blaine and I joining you now. But let's continue then to get reaction from this particular loss. Let's bring in political analyst on the life and times of Tito Mboweni. Joining us now is political analyst Bongani Mahlangu. Mr. Mahlangu, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Just taking off from what President Cyril Ramaphosa said in his eulogy in terms of the legacy that Tito Mboweni, leaves behind. Just talk to us about what your observations are. Particularly, I want to draw reference to the point where he said that Tito Mboweni was able to see how safeguarding the independence and the mandate of the South African Reserve Bank works. Again, it talks to a lot of the things that Tito Mboweni did during his tenure of protecting independence of institutions. Just your thoughts.
Thanks, and greetings to you in studio and viewers at home. First off, is to send condolences to the Mboweni family and to say to Tito Mboweni that he should rest in peace. If we were to start there, you would remember that when Tito Mboweni was the Reserve Bank governor, and he also became the minister in the treasury. So then when he was a minister who has the responsibility towards the Reserve Bank, indeed, he did not amend Section 4 of the South African Reserve Bank Act, which would then allow for the so-called nationalization, would allow the president to appoint the full set of directors from the Reserve Bank. So he was opposed to that, and that never happened. He also never utilized Section 10 of the South African Reserve Bank Act, which allows the Reserve Bank to loan money to the state at zero interest. And if that were to be done, that means South Africa as a country would not have to be exposed to domestic or foreign capital markets that charge them market-related or any interest whatsoever. And that would have sped up investment spending by the state, which have obviously uplifted the economy and created much-needed jobs. So what he also did do was that under his tenure as the minister in the Treasury, he did then introduce fiscal consolidation, which the attempt or the intent was to bring debt under control, promote economic growth, ensuring that we move away from consumption spending to investment spending. The latter two would have, in fact, the three objectives of fiscal consolidation would have not been significantly met. But what we did see instead was a reduction of government expenditure, and especially at a time when this reduction was not supposed to be reduced because the economy was in a downturn, it was COVID, so government needed to spend in order to stimulate the economy. So we did not see that. Over and above that, when we look into the performance agreement that Tito Mboweni would have signed with the president at the time, some of the things that he was supposed to do was to ensure the number of youth startups, was given a target of the number of youth startups, strengthen municipal financial systems, creation or establishment of a state bank, township economies, investment and support strategy. So those things were not significantly witnessed under his tenure. However, we have to go back as well when he was the Minister of Labour. There were great things that were achieved during that tenure. And some of the things that were achieved were the legislation that was passed. I'm talking about Employment Equity Act. If you look at the Employment Equity Act, it's very progressive, especially Section 20, subsection 3, 4, 5, and 6 of the Act. If you look into the Basic Conditions of Employment Act 1997, if you look into the Labor Relations Act of 1995. So that is why we have a set of very progressive labor laws. And those laws were passed under his tenure as the Minister of Labour then, and we still maintain them today because of their level of progressiveness.
Mr. Mahlangu, I was listening to Zwelinzima Vavi from SAFTU saying that without a sympathetic minister like that of Tito Mboweni, that act that you just quoted now, the Basic Conditions Act, wouldn't have been possible because of his contribution to this. But talk to us about, not everybody, of course, agreed with his policy stance, fiscal discipline, etc. How do you think he navigated through the need to please versus what he needed to do in order to get us over the hill?
All right, no, thanks. I think I must issue this disclaimer that he was a public personality. And people will always reflect on how they would have experienced him subject to where they stand in society. So some people would applaud, some people would criticize, and there's nothing wrong. There's no malicious intent, because even now we are not talking about him at a personal level, but him as a public personality. So going back to the question is that, you see, when the fiscal consolidation was introduced, which some call austerity measures, as I said, the economy was really not doing well. So common or conventional economic theory would then tell you that when the economy is in a downturn, government needs to increase its expenditure to stimulate the economy. So what the minister then did, which was Tito Mboweni, he did actually the opposite. He cut spending. And the cuts are still being experienced today in 2024, whereas South Africans are struggling. If you remember, after him cutting that expenditure, there were even revolts in society where even the Youth League then, his own organization, marched against him for his voluntary resignation from the position. There were strikes from the student sector because he had cut the baseline of higher education then, and also other critical expenditure items which are important to the poor and the working class, which forms majority of South Africa, which are Black or African in particular. So that would have made him very unpopular. Was the debt stabilized? Not necessarily. Today, you have a public sector that is struggling to fund what it needs to fund in order to get going, from national, provinces, and as far also as municipalities are concerned. So that would have made him unpopular. If you remember, immediately after he was appointed as the minister, he called I think 2 economists from the USA. These 2 economists, I would have forgotten their names, but they are very popular globally for their neoliberal approach to economics. And the question was, why are you bringing such people to South Africa, where we don't need neoliberal economic policies because of our political, social, and economic setup? And there was no proper explanation then. It was also under the same tenure that we went to the foreign labor markets, I think during COVID, to get a loan that was said to be 0 rated, meaning no interest. But remember, even if it was 0 rated, it was subject to the exchange rate between the rand and the dollar, of which then the rand depreciated against the dollar at the time of payment or servicing the debt. Meaning that South Africa would have needed to pay more than what they got. And then that means that it actually, in real terms, increased the debt to GDP of South Africans, because ultimately it's you and I that pay. So that would have made him unpopular. But as I said, as so much as he was not really popular when you look into the nitty-gritties of him being a finance minister, but he did make positive contributions to South Africa, even when he was the governor of the Reserve Bank. But unfortunately, when he became the minister, he said it himself that he will not amend Section 4, as I spoke about. And Section 4 is critical when it comes to getting the bank under the full control of the state. It did also, as you put it in the introduction, it didn't also amend the mandate, which is inflation targeting of 3 to 6%. So even today, we see a Reserve Bank that is solely focused on inflation targeting and not necessarily reaching full employment for South Africans. And that is why we find ourselves in the crisis that we're in, where the Reserve Bank would have increased the inflation or interest rate by, I think, 400 and so basis points. And it's only in the recent sitting where they reduced, but the reduction is insignificant. So a lot of South Africans are still struggling to make ends meet right now. Right. So Tito Mboweni would have contributed in that space, but that does not necessarily mean he was a bad person. That does not necessarily mean he was a bad leader, because some of the things that he did are in the performance agreement that he signed. So if we were to say that individually he was a bad leader, we should then say that the person that he signed the performance agreement with, which would have been his line manager at the time, the president, is equally bad.
All right, let's leave it there. Thank you so much for that, Bongani Mahlangu, as we continue then to get reaction. Thank you so much for that.